Thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I've been a little intimidated by the presentation so far with all these well-polished, finished studies. I'm going to show you something that's not fully cooked yet, very much in progress work. This is on using some of these interviewing agents to better understand how humans think about politics and current events and what our government should do about stuff. A couple disclaimers before we get started. I'm actually on paternity leave, so if I'm a little fuzzy and don't have my thoughts together, I have a very good reason why. She started daycare recently, so that's why I'm able to be here. But anyways, second thing, as I mentioned, this is actually my first time presenting any actual data from this project. So I'm going to try to leave some time for questions and comments at the end, because we are very much a lot of different directions we can still go with this. So with that out of the way, this is about reconsidering what we mean when we say public opinion. So I want you to think for a second, what is public opinion? This is you get first day of grad school in your public opinion seminar, you get asked what public opinion is and nobody knows the answer. I think there's this common assumption or common sort of folk theory of public opinion. Now, if you pay any amount of attention to politics or current events, this is what public opinion looks like a lot of the time, right? Something happens, we go into the field with a survey, we come back in a day or two with X% of Americans think X about Y. And so, this might be related to immediate current events, immediate government policy, things of that nature. And I want to problematize two things about this flavor of public opinion research. One is I'm not quite sure that we're measuring opinions when we do this, right? If I'm having a conversation with you and I ask for your opinion about whether trans people should be allowed to serve in the military, and you say yes or no, I might expect more than a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Here, in social media research, we would recognize this as a stance, in stance detection, which is not the same thing as giving a reason to explain yourself and defend your position. And second, in political science, we're a little more precise about calling this mass opinion as opposed to public opinion. What we've done here is taken a bunch of stances and aggregated them into this thing we call the mass public, but no one's actually doing anything public in this exercise, right? They're taking a survey, they might be on their phone watching TV, answering some survey questions in the privacy of their own home without explaining themselves to anybody or having that kind of conversation. Right, so not really public, and this method of mass opinion research actually traces its roots back to market research, figuring out consumer behavior. And there are certainly some contexts where politics is like a consumption choice, right? You go into the voting booth, you privately check a box, you want the Republican basket of goods instead of the Democratic basket of goods, and that's fine. But for matters of collective decision making, such as what should the military do with respect to trans service members, we might not want to hold a referendum on that, right? There are all these cases where politics is not like consumer behavior, and treating it like consumer behavior doesn't let us do some things we might want to do to learn about public opinion on that issue, right? We might want reasons. We might want respondents to be able to explain themselves and articulate their opinion. We might want them to engage with opposing views in the context of this exercise, right? They might want to be challenged a little bit on what other people in our society think about this issue and how would you respond. And we might want to know how opinions on this issue fit into a broader belief system, which is something that surveys are really bad for doing, right? We ask you a bunch of things independently. We might look at the correlations in the aggregate, but we have a very hard time figuring out how you specifically fit these ideas together. And I think all of these things are important for both the public and the opinion in what we call public opinion, right? So normally, if you want to get this kind of depth into people's attitudes, you need to go qualitative, right? A human is very good at eliciting these kinds of attitudes, having that conversation with people. And we are not the first research team to figure out that you can try to do this with LLMs, right? You can have the LLM adopt the persona of the interviewer to try to probe on some of these things. So we're partnered with, there's a company now, there are a few companies that do this. Focal Data has a platform where you can recruit respondents directly to talk to their interviewing agent. And so we're doing this. So we have study one. we're interested in how respondents think about the death penalty. It's an issue that's not super salient in the news, but has a variety of sort of moral considerations, empirical considerations. Reasonable people can disagree about its application, things of that nature. And people have thought some, but not a ton about it. So we thought it was a good test case issue. We are doing a convenience sample at this stage. This is our pilot. We're not interested in representative samples yet. We just want to know how these interviewing agents behave and what we can learn from this kind of format. So study one, get some demographics there. The platform that Focal Data provides asks you to provide the structure. So you can give 3 to 5, we did 4 research questions, and it's going to organize the interview around this kind of format. So we wanted to kick things off with, give us your stance and your reason, right? What do you think the government should do about the death penalty? Why do you think that should be the case? Then we ask, so it'll probe a little bit from there, right? Ask you to engage with a little bit of disagreement, things of that nature. Second, we want people to think really seriously about the value conflict. Why do you think other people disagree about this? Why is this a contentious issue? Probe a little bit there. We ask, the third question here is about issue importance, right? In a survey, everyone will give you a box that they've checked on the death penalty. We don't know if you actually care about it, if you're just answering the question. So we're interested in how important is it for you to get your way on this issue? Are there compromises you'd be willing to accept? Are there politicians you might vote for even if you disagree with them on the issue? And then last, we're going to ask that sort of broader belief system question. We ask the interviewing agent to identify a value or principle that the interviewee had already articulated earlier in the interview, and ask them if they would extend that to some other issue unrelated necessarily to the death penalty. We're still ironing out some kinks there that I'll talk about in a minute, but we think there's a lot of potential there. Okay. Methods-wise, we have all these raw interviews. We need to do stuff with them. What we've come up with so far is we start by getting rid of style effects and things like that by standardizing them into a summary. So we have an LLM summarize the interviews, and that's our input data for a topic model. I like per topic for embedding sentence level topic models so we can see what comes up in these interviews. And then we also annotated them for some stuff we might be interested in, right? So overall stance, we care about, do people generally support or oppose the death penalty? Why do they think that? How certain are they? How open are they to compromise? And then I'll talk later about those big abstract ideas that people articulate. How are they basing their stances? And then what are those other connections to additional issues that they bring up? So those summaries look like this. We get a few paragraphs out of the longer interview. You can start to get a sense of how people are articulating their views in a broader context, right? So this is a black woman who leans left, opposes the death penalty. They're worried about wrongful convictions and disproportionate impact on people of color. This is very long. We're not going to read the whole thing, but you get the idea, right? That we're learning stuff about this individual level interview on the death penalty. You can contrast this with, here's a white man who supports the death penalty. They engage with some of the arguments. They say, yeah, wrongful convictions, I'm worried about. We should reform the system to get rid of them. This is a very common sentiment in how people think about the death penalty. We can imagine a world where we execute the people who really deserve it and we don't execute people who don't really deserve it. Some kinks to work out there in terms of getting the interviewing agent to push a little bit on if that's really possible. But summaries feed into topic models. So here's, again, more than you probably care to read. But this is overall prevalence of what people talked about when they talked about the death penalty. So we have sorted here by overall proportion of respondents who mention these topics at least once. The interesting action is going to be in the difference between people who support and oppose. Right? So everybody talks about justice and closure for victims' families. Well, not everybody, but it's the modal the most commonly referred to topic. This is both because people who support the death penalty bring it up, and if you say you oppose the death penalty, the interviewing agent is going to ask you about it. This is a very common argument, so people have to engage it one way or the other. But you can see that the death penalty as a deterrent for future crimes. Other people aren't going to commit crimes if they fear the death penalty. Comes up much more among people who support the death penalty than oppose it, for reasons you might expect. On the flip side, People who oppose the death penalty are much more likely to talk about life in prison as an alternative, right? This is a thing we can do instead, right? This is certainly a severe enough punishment without needing to execute people. So you can see how, just at a very high level, we're starting to unpack the bases for these stances. And if you've ever had a conversation about the death penalty, a lot of this is going to sound familiar. Perhaps more interestingly, we can get into the broader sort of concepts that people are bringing to bear here. So again, the most commonly referred to big idea here is justice, retribution, and this is largely driven by people who support the death penalty. Death penalty supporters also talk about protecting society, right? This is a sort of element of the criminal justice system that we need to protect people from wrongdoers. The ideas articulated by people who oppose the death penalty tend to be a little more spread out. So they tend to drive conversation relating to human rights, rehabilitation, moral principles, social support, in ways that feed into some of these other ideas that they talk about. So we look at these extensions into other areas of policy. First off, a lot of people, when you ask, do you connect the death penalty to anything else, they say no. And it's actually even more frequent among people who support the death penalty. They say this issue is isolated, I don't connect it to anything else, which I think is interesting and also, given what we know about political behavior research, kind of expected. But one more caveat. Immigration and taxation, I mentioned we had some trouble with the interviewer here. We had to, in order to get the interviewer to behave the way we wanted to, prompt it with some examples of issues that people might connect to. And so immigration and taxation were provided in the prompt and then volunteered that to a lot of the respondents. So those pop up more frequently than they probably would have by chance. So I'm going to not interpret those. But I think it's also notable that for people who oppose the death penalty, they bring up a lot of systemic issues, right? Economic inequality, healthcare, healthcare access, which I think connects back to when they talk about social support, equality, things of that nature. There's a subset of respondents who see their views on the death penalty as part of a broader, or their opposition to the death penalty as part of a broader political program related to systemic issues and inequality. So that's where we're at so far. Again, very early stages. But I think there's the potential here to get more depth in how we understand public opinion in ways that make it a more useful input to democratic decision making. And we still have some more work to do on getting the interviewing agent to behave more like you might think a human would, and actually challenging people on some of their assumptions about how the world could work in their ideal vision relative to facts on the ground, what's actually possible. There are a couple very obvious extensions of this work. We haven't experimented with actually comparing to what you get in this format versus what you would get if you just fielded your more standard survey. I've got a grant in the works on that, so we'll see how that goes. And then there's another, I think, ways to blend the two approaches. So one thing that you could imagine doing, right, is identifying a compromise proposal among the people you've interviewed that you can then feed back into a more standard mass opinion survey to see how these two ideas might link up. And a few, again, we're early stages, practical challenges that we're thinking through. One is this trade-off between structure and flexibility. Right, so the more structure you give to the interview, the more it resembles a survey, and the easier it is to analyze. The more flexible it is, the more you let respondents speak in their own terms, the harder it is to actually make use of the data. And this is just, you got to locate yourself somewhere on this spectrum, and we're still trying to figure out where we should locate. Second is we completely punted on representativeness and sampling for this stage, but we can't do that forever. And the propensity to be interviewed in this way is certainly not random. This is something that the pollsters are having a hard time with now. I don't think we can escape it forever, which might make things like experimentation and within subject designs really important for this kind of work. Third, I think there's some really interesting discussions to have more broadly in this kind of work about reproducibility and researcher degrees of freedom. You have to make choices along the way of what goes in your prompts. Again, that immigration and taxation example. Which models do you use? Although we heard earlier, it might not matter so much whether you use Llama or OpenAI, but it still might matter. And I think it's interesting in this case where the comparison is to qualitative research, where the human is themselves kind of a black box, but there are still decisions that you have free parameters over that you should be sensitive to those kinds of variations. And finally, we were working with a third party here, and that was great in a lot of ways. I think longer term, for scientific purposes, you'd want to build your own software. I am not a software developer, but I think eventually we are going to want to have a little more control over some of these levers so we can answer some of these other questions on that researcher degrees of freedom front. So with that, hopefully I've left some time for some questions.